Dr. Gabor Mate, thank you for joining us.
Such a pleasure. Thank you.
Welcome to Winnipeg.
Nice to be here.
You say there is a strong connection between trauma and not only mental illness, but physical health, physical disease.
Yeah.
How so?
Well, I don't say it. I do say it, but the science also says it. So, as far back to the 19th century, the great Canadian physician, Sir William Osler, talked about rheumatoid arthritis as being a stress-driven disorder. Now, if you look at Canada today, the people most at risk for rheumatoid arthritis are Indigenous women. Why? Because they're women and because they're Indigenous. And so they have undergone more trauma than anybody else in this country as a group. So the relationship between trauma and physical illness is very simple. Trauma inflicts inflammation in the body. It changes how our genes function in a negative way. It makes it more likely that we get malignancy. A Canadian study showed that men who are sexually abused are 3 times as likely to have a heart attack as adults than other people. So trauma has physical manifestations because the emotions associated with trauma also have physical manifestations. So what I'm really saying is that the mind and the body can't be separated. So whatever happens to us emotionally will have its manifestations physically.
How well does Western medicine recognize this connection? Well,
they don't. The average medical student, despite all the evidence linking multiple sclerosis, malignancy, breast cancer, rheumatoid arthritis, autoimmune disease in general, mental illnesses in general, to trauma, the average medical student in this country does not receive a single lecture on trauma and its relationship to illness, which is astonishing. And the average physician, they don't know about it because even though the scientific literature shows it, it's not introduced into the medical curriculum. So no, it's a neglected topic.
But as you say, there's a long history drawing connections. Why do you think it is an ignored topic or not followed through, not studied more by medical professionals?
Yeah, I think there's several reasons. First of all, the Western mindset for hundreds of years has separated mind from the body. And medicine, as much as we like to think about it as a science, which it is, it's got a significant scientific component, all very great. It's also an ideology, which kind of reflects the ideology of the culture. So there's a mind-body separation in Western culture in general, number one. Number two, the people that go to medical school are very often traumatized people. They're very driven, they're very stressed. The medical school itself is really hard on people. They have to put up with a lot of very stressful situations and relationships and circumstances. And they have to ignore that in order to get to medical school. So they ignore their own trauma. And therefore they just are blind to the traumas of others. Number three, the research that is presented in a lot of the medical journals is funded by people who profit from the research, which is to say the pharmaceutical companies. There's lots of profit to be made from coming up with a new antidepressant, but there's no profit to be made in studying how to deal with the trauma that caused the depression in the first place. So that's the literature that doctors see, even though very frequently there are articles in the medical literature relating trauma and stress to illness. They tend to be ignored because the physicians don't know what to do with it. For example, there was a study 3 years ago that showed that women with severe post-traumatic stress disorder have double the risk of ovarian cancer. And the milder the symptoms, the less their risk for ovarian cancer. That was published in a major medical journal from Harvard University. The average gynecologist has never heard about it.
You talk about medical professionals themselves being stressed.
Yeah.
Well, you can see the Canadian healthcare crisis instead of system slipped out because the Canadian healthcare system is in crisis. We're hearing from medical professionals of all stripes right now.
Yeah.
If you were going to fix the system, where would you start?
Well, first of all, I would begin with the education of medical students. I would teach them about trauma, all the science linking trauma and stress to adult illness. There's a British psychologist, member of the British Academy, who recently said that the link between, for example, childhood trauma or childhood distress and adult mental illness is as strongly established scientifically as the link between smoking and lung cancer. So first of all, I would introduce that information to the medical schools. Secondly, I would introduce self-care into the education of medical students so that they don't put up with circumstances that are unreasonable. Thirdly, I would arrange a system that doesn't stress physicians so much and nurses and so on. In other words, a system be much less hierarchical, much more democratic, and it would include concern for the practitioners as well as for the patients. All that would not cost more money, it would cost less money.
But right now it seems that we've got this fee-for-service basis where everyone's quite rushed, and you've got 17 people in your waiting room, and if you're an ER doc, there's more people. So everything is, time is money. There's no time for a physician to stop and say, tell me about your childhood.
Well, yes and no. I mean, that's true. There's this time pressure, and but the problem isn't just a lack of time. The problem is it doesn't even occur to the physician to say it. For example, multiple studies have shown the relationship between stress and trauma and multiple sclerosis. It's not even controversial. But you go to a neurologist, they never heard of it. So it's not just that they don't have the time. A specialist would have time to spend 5 minutes with a patient saying, listen, let's deal with the physical aspects of your illness, but then let me then send you to somebody who can talk to you about some of the emotional factors that trigger your flare-ups. And maybe we can mitigate them and eliminate those triggers. They don't think of it because they don't know about it, despite all the research. So the big gap here is not just time, which is significant, but the lack of awareness.
Okay, so say you're an aware patient, just looking for solutions now. When you go in and talk to your doctor, what should we do? What can we do as individuals to make things better, not just in the medical system, but in our stressed out world as it is?
Well, first of all, as to that, what I say to people is, if you go to a butcher shop, are you going to try and buy a birthday cake? Or if you go to a bakery, are you going to ask for a cut of sirloin? Don't go to the doctor asking to talk about emotional things. Most of them don't get that kind of training. But if you recognize that there's a connection, as there is, scientifically, not just scientifically, but also in traditional medicinal practices, there's this unity of mind and body. And if you recognize that, and if your doctor doesn't, get the help from your doctor that they can give you, but go somewhere else to get the emotional support.
But the emotional support, if you're talking about a psychiatrist or a psychologist, that's extremely expensive and out of the reach of many, many Canadians.
It's true. It's true. Most psychiatrists are not even trained to provide that. I mean, they don't. They're mostly trained in what's called biological psychiatry, which is how to change the biology of the brain to mitigate the symptoms of depression or psychosis or ADHD or whatever, but they don't have any training in understanding the traumatic and stress-based causes of those conditions, let alone how to reverse them. Some psychologists have that training, some don't. Psychology can be a very shallow profession, or it can be very deep, depending on the training that people receive. Well, it's true, and this is where we have to come into the more general picture. If young families were given the right parenting advice about how not to stress their kids. For example, a lot of parents these days are told not to pick up their kid when they're crying.
Of course not, because you're going to make them soft. They've got to cry it out, or they're going to do this every night. That's what we've all been taught.
Now you tell a mother gorilla not to pick up their baby when they're crying, or tell a mother dog to ignore their infant's distress, or tell any indigenous person to ignore the cries of their infants. I'm talking about indigenous people whose culture is not being overwhelmed by colonialism. They would laugh at you. They pick up their kids all the time. They don't let their kids cry. Crying is because the child is stressed, because the child wants the connection. When you don't give the child the connection they need, you're actually flooding their brain with cortisol, which interferes with brain development. So actually, the way to make kids independent and resilient is to meet their needs. Then they'll develop independence and resilience as a matter of nature. So we have, all I'm saying is that there's so much that we get wrong in this culture that is so simple that if we actually knew how to meet the needs of children, a lot of children would be much less stressed and traumatized.
There is a lot in the book about our toxic culture, and there's an awful lot about that seems overwhelming. How do we change it? I mean, I can hear parents now feeling guilty about the times they let their children cry and thinking, well, I've got to go to work. I can't possibly. Where do we start?
Well, first of all, let's deal with the guilt. Nobody deliberately hurts their children. Most parents, even parents who are harsh with their kids, basically love their kids. They just don't know any better. So let's drop the guilt. I used to be one of these parents. I passed on my trauma to my own children. I didn't do it deliberately. I didn't know I was doing it. So guilt, responsibility is good, but guilt is just toxic. So I won't recommend guilt to begin with. What was the second part of your question?
Where do we start to make it better? It's overwhelming, and I know there is optimism in your book.
Yeah,
but
why
you gotta look for
why is
it.
it overwhelming, I wonder?
Because it's so much. It seems pervasive. It's in every sector of everything, it feels.
Well, that's the point. We have to get that what we think is normal in this culture is neither natural nor healthy. So first we have to understand the problem. Once you understand the problem, the solutions are not that difficult. How about prenatal care, where mothers' emotional needs are looked at as well as their physical needs? Because we know that stress on pregnant women has an impact on the infant in the uterus, a negative impact. How about we start with that? How about we start with teaching young parents how to meet the needs of children, actually teaching them about the needs of children in the first place, so that we don't try to fit the kid into our model of what they should be like, but we meet the child's needs so that their development can be natural and unfold along the ways that their own particular nature intended for them. Those kids will be resilient, they'll be independent. How about if we teach our teachers that a lot of the behaviors that upset them in the classroom are not bad behaviors, but the signs of stressed brains in our children. And so that the way to respond to them is not with punishment and control, but with actually compassion and understanding. These are very basic ideas. How about teaching medical students again about the relationship between trauma and physiology, between stress and physiology? These are simple concepts, and again, they would save us a whole lot of money. How about teaching our legal system? I mean, look at the Canadian legal system. It's an outrage. 50% of the women in this jail in this country are Indigenous. They make up 5% of the female population. Why? Because they're the most traumatized segment. How about if the average lawyer was taught a little bit about trauma? How about the judges understood that what they're dealing with is trauma? They don't get a single lecture on it in their education. In other words, how about if we introduce some rational wisdom into the education of physicians, teachers, lawyers, let alone politicians, It wouldn't be as overwhelming as it seems.
So you still have optimism?
I met Noam Chomsky. Chomsky was once asked, is he an optimist or a pessimist? He says, well, strategically I'm an optimist and tactically I'm a pessimist. And what he means by that is that in the short term it's getting worse. But in the long term, I believe in human beings. I believe in that human beings have the capacity to heal. And I've seen lots of examples of that in my own personal life. I've experienced the healing myself from my own trauma to a significant degree. I believe in human goodness, despite all the evidence to the contrary. So I believe that we could do much better, yeah.
We have to try.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
My pleasure.